My dear brothers and sisters in Christ, there is a legend about Abraham that every day he held off eating his breakfast until a hungry person came by who could share his breakfast with him. And one day, a very old man who looked very hungry came along, and Abraham invited him to his table. And just as they were about to eat, the old man offered a pagan blessing. And at that very moment, Abraham jumped up and he ordered the man away from his table and away from his house. And immediately God spoke to him and said, "Abraham, Abraham, I have been feeding that man for 80 years, giving him food every day. Couldn't you have tolerated him for just one meal?" The story says, "Abraham, why were you so intolerant?" And the scriptures today is telling us that we have to be careful not to be intolerant and rigid towards others who may not think like us or believe like us. We have that account in the gospel where John comes to Jesus and says, "We've seen someone expelling demons in your name, and he doesn't belong to our group. He doesn't follow with us. He's not part of us." And what did Jesus say? "Do not prevent him, for there is no one who can do a good deed in my name who can speak against me. For whoever is not against us is for us." And then we have the account from the Old Testament where there were 70 men who had been designated to be elders for the people of Israel. And they had all been called to the tent of meeting where there would be a ceremony to call the Spirit down on them. And there were 2 of these men who had been designated, whose names were on the list, but who hadn't shown up at that tent of meeting. And their names were Eldad and Medad. And so one day, Eldad and Medad are in the group and they're prophesying. And immediately someone came to Moses and said, "Eldad and Medad are prophesying, and they weren't even at the meeting tent at that ceremony for the calling down of the Spirit." And Joshua, who would follow Moses as the next leader of the people, said, "Moses, we should stop them." And Moses, who was a more wise man, said, "Are you jealous for my sake? Would that all the people of Israel were prophets. Would that all had the Spirit of the Lord on them and prophesying." And so, a second example of where tolerance, understanding, openness, lack of rigidity is necessary. Last week, the homeless ministry went to do their usual good work at Ozanam Inn. And when they came back, they were a little confused, and there was a little bit of argument back and forth about something that had happened. When they went to Ozanam Inn, they met up with a couple of volunteers who were there and who had declared that they were Freemasons, Masons. And so they said among themselves, "Should we allow them to work with us in feeding the poor?" And they brought that question to me. Should we have allowed them to help serve the poor? And I said, yeah, why not? I mean, what's wrong with getting the help that you need in serving the poor? And they said, yeah, but you know, they're Freemasons. But the thing is, even as Freemasons, they were not doing a bad thing. They were cooperating in feeding the poor and doing what was beautiful before the Lord. So what we see is that there should be an openness to people. There are a number of things that we can do, and I asked some questions of the people. I said, did they insult you or make fun of you? And they said no. And I said, did they try to push their way of thinking on you? And again, they said no. They said they were very nice. So all the more reason that they should have been welcome to doing the work of God, whether they believed in him or not, since Jesus says, who is not against us is for us. You see, what's important is that we don't lose our beliefs. We continue to maintain our beliefs. The second thing, it's very important that we respect that there can be differences and that not everybody's always going to be on the same page, on the same way of believing as we are. But that even people who believe and people who don't believe can come together to do good things, to work together on common projects in doing good for other people. We can affirm that even people who don't believe as we do are capable of doing good things. What's important is that when we do it, we know it's the light of Christ that's shining through the work that we're doing, and we are doing the work of God. And so I think one of the principal lessons we need to get from the scriptures today is that we have to be tolerant of people who don't believe as we do and don't see things as we do, but who are doing good works and appreciate the good work that they're doing. Now, in the gospel, Jesus also speaks of a couple of other things. This gospel is filled with advice from Jesus. He talks about scandal. And what is scandal? Scandal is behavior that leads other people to do bad things, to do evil. And Jesus says we should never scandalize young people. He says we should never scandalize those who are vulnerable. Never scandalize those who are new in the faith. We should always behave in a way that we encourage good and not encourage evil. And he said anyone who scandalizes or leads a small one or a vulnerable person into doing wrong should have a millstone tied around their neck and thrown into the sea. Now, I don't know if Jesus literally meant that. I don't think he did. Jesus uses hyperbole, uses exaggeration in a lot of the ways that he speaks to say, really be careful about this, that it's something you really want to avoid. And so in the same context of hyperbole, he talks about avoiding sin. And he says, if your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. If your foot causes you to sin, cut it off. And if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. He's not literally telling us to go and do those things. Otherwise, we'd be walking around and it'd just be crippled people all around us and half-blind people all around us. But what he's saying is avoid those things that might lead you to sin. Don't go to those places where you know you might fall into doing sinful things. Be careful of the temptations that might come your way so that you can avoid those things that might lead us into sin. Jesus is just being very forceful in the ways that he's speaking to us about avoiding sin in our lives. But I think one of the best lessons comes through the second reading today in St. James. And St. James is not criticizing rich people. It almost sounds like he is. He says your wealth is going to disappear, your beautiful clothes are going to be moth-eaten, and your gold and your silver are all going to rust away, and all your riches are going to corrode, and you're going to be left. But what he's really saying is that be careful that the riches that you have acquired have not come to you in a bad way through injustice that you have caused other people. He says the wages of the harvesters of your fields are crying out to me. If you've withheld paying wages to someone and they're poor and you're rich because you've made them poor, he said that's an awful sin. And we have to realize that what's even more important than charity is social justice, that we be involved in social justice issues. You know, it's beautiful that we go out and feed the poor, even if it's not every Sunday, a couple Sundays a month. But wouldn't it be better if we were working to eliminate poverty altogether, eliminate homelessness, eliminate unemployment? All those homeless people very often are people who are not well mentally, and we were working to provide health care for those who are mentally ill. That the money that we spend sometimes for armaments, that money was being channeled to helping people who need to be helped because of mental issues or poverty issues or health issues. And so I think the scriptures today give us plenty of food for thought of how we should live as Christians, being tolerant and accepting and loving towards everyone, whether they believe as we do, and avoiding sin, but especially providing social justice for those who are most unfortunate and most needy in our society.